The countdown worked really well there, didn't it? Look at that. I'm impressed with you all hushing down. I thought I was going to have to get up and ask you to be quiet. It's really lovely. Thank you all for coming along this evening. Welcome to the King Centre. My name is Ben, and I'm one of the pastors here at Cheshunt Evangelical. And I'm really, really pleased to be hosting tonight's evening. What would Jesus say to Stephen Hawking? I think, let me just start by just saying this. We looked at this a little bit last week, and we'll do this again next week. Why should we even care about what Jesus would say to anyone? You see, Jesus lived 2,000 years ago in a little country called Israel, okay, miles away from here, in a time that was very different to the time that we now live in. But what's interesting is you read the Gospels, and if you haven't read the Gospels, I'd encourage you to do that, is that he met lots of different people from all sorts of different backgrounds, and he always had interesting things to say to people. Things that they came with a question, and then Jesus gave an answer that would change their lives forever. And not just change their lives, but change the lives of people who've been reading those words thousands of years afterwards. So I became a Christian when I was 19 years old, after reading the words of Jesus and realizing relevant to people that lived 2,000 years ago. They were relevant to my life. So now it's a helpful question to ask. What would Jesus say to 21st century people and 21st century situations? And we believe as a church, passionately, that the Bible isn't just an antiquated book for the ages. It is a book that is relevant and worthy to be looked at and pondered over for questions like this. So that's why we've put this evening on, and last week and next week, because we believe Jesus has relevant things to say to people in our generation. And we want to demonstrate that by looking at three different people, different worldviews, different situations. So last week we looked at what would Jesus say to Donald Trump. Next week we're looking at what Jesus would say to Caitlyn Jenner. And this week we are looking at what Jesus would say to Stephen Hawking. And I'm very pleased to say that we have a guest speaker tonight. It's not me. Simon Forshaw, who was an elder of our church up until about 18 months ago, and he's moved away, and he's come back. And later on you'll be able to say hello to him again. But Simon is a fantastic guy, evangelistic things together. Simon particularly spent a lot of time thinking about the philosophy of the sorts of things we'll be looking at this evening, so I thought he'd be a really interesting person to have come and speak tonight. But that's enough of that. We'll have an intro in just a minute, but just let me give you a brief overview of how the evening will run. I've done my blurb, okay? This is all being streamed on YouTube right now. Simon, we're going to watch a video in just a few minutes that will give us a bit of an overview of the life and the thinking that Stephen Hawking portrays. It's about 12 minutes long. And then pretty much immediately after that, Simon's going to come up and give a talk, which will be about 20 minutes long. And after that, we're going to have a Q&A panel, a question and answer time, where you'll be able to ask Simon and two other members of the panel questions that you think are relevant to the subject this evening. So please, as we're going through the evening, please think if there's something that you'd like to have clarification on, or a question that you would like to answer that's relevant for you or for someone that you know, please do ask. But let me just stress that the Q&A section will not be live streamed. Okay, so you're not going to be sent out there viral across the internet by asking an embarrassing question. Anything you say will not be used against you in the future. Okay, you just ask whatever you want. It'll be absolutely fine. So it's just the first part of the service that will be streamed. The end won't be. But just one other thing to say is that obviously over the course of these 3 weeks, we'll be talking about things that some people find very controversial. And we shouldn't be embarrassed about that. We should embrace that kind of thing. But I think it's really helpful to say that we seek to show respect to the people that we're talking about, but also to each other. So if you have a different view than somebody else, so you don't agree with something that somebody says, that's fine. You're welcome here. We want as many people from as many different backgrounds as possible to engage, and you're free to ask your questions. But we do ask that it's all done with respect and for each other and for the people that we're talking about. Okay, that said, now we're going to watch a video. So if we could have the lights down here, let's introduce us to the life of Stephen Hawking.
Hello. My name is Stephen Hawking, physicist, cosmologist, and something of a dreamer. Although I cannot move, and I have to speak through a computer, in my mind, I am free.
Free to explore the deepest questions of the universe. Among them, the deepest of all. Is there a God who created and controls the universe, from the stars and the planets to you and me? Finding out takes us on a journey through the laws of nature. But there, I think, lies the answer to the age-old mystery of how the universe was made and how it really works.
Check it out.
Stephen William Hawking was born in Oxford, England on the 300th anniversary of the death of Galileo on January 8, 1942. At 17 years old, he entered Oxford University.
Stephen Hawking has admitted in many cases that he was not the most ambitious student. One day he calculated that he spent about maybe an hour a day on schoolwork.
In 1962, Hawking moved to Cambridge University for a PhD in cosmology, and 1 year later was diagnosed with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease.
ALS is a progressive motor neuron disease, so over time the victim loses functionality of muscles. And over the past decades, Stephen Hawking has gradually lost the use of most of his muscles, but his mind remains quite keen.
I think that once he was hit with this earth-shattering diagnosis, he actually sought a refuge in doing physics. And if anything, it helped him become one of the world's great scientists.
Although his diagnosis only gave him 2.5 years to live, Hawking married in 1965 and stunned the science world in 1974 with his PhD on black holes.
Stephen taught us how to define a black hole. He then made a brilliant discovery that black holes can radiate, Hawking radiation. That then showed the whole world the connection between black hole physics and thermodynamics. And that connection has been a central theme in theoretical physics ever since.
He became the Sherman Fairchild Distinguished Scholar at Tech in 1974. And 5 years later, Hawking was named Cambridge University's Lucasian Professor of Mathematics, an honor bestowed on only 14 people since 1663.
Stephen Hawking is a theoretical physicist of a very specific kind. He studies cosmology. That's trying to understand the very basic laws of physics as well as where the universe itself came from.
Hawking sees things that other people didn't see, time and again. He just thinks more deeply than most of the rest of us. And those insights have had big consequences.
Even though Hawking deteriorated to the point that he needed a computerized speech synthesizer to speak, he wrote A Brief History of Time in 1988, selling more than 10 million copies.
Stephen Hawking's book, A Brief History of Time, which was a bestseller for weeks and weeks, was about some of the most profound questions that face humanity. It's really about where we come from and where we're headed, from a physicist's point of view.
After expanding upon his work with several more books, Hawking increased his popularity by guest starring in TV shows like The Simpsons, Star Trek: The Next Generation, and The Big Bang Theory.
A star, more than 3 times the size of our sun, ought to end its life how? With a collapse. The gravitational forces of the entire mass overcoming the electromagnetic forces of individual atoms and so collapsing inwards. If the star is massive enough, it will continue this collapse, creating a black hole, where the warping of space-time is so great that nothing can escape, not even light. It gets smaller, smaller. The star, in fact, gets denser as atoms, even subatomic particles, get literally crushed into smaller and smaller space. And at its end point, what are we left with? A space-time singularity. Space and time come to a stop.
If Einstein is right, or if general relativity is correct, then
Yes.
universe is expanding, yes?
Yes.
Okay, so if you reverse time, and the universe is getting smaller.
All right.
So, what if I reverse the process all the way back to see what happened at the beginning of time itself?
At the beginning of time itself?
Yes. So the universe getting smaller and smaller, getting denser and denser, hotter and hotter as we...
You mean wind back the clock?
Exactly, wind back the clock.
Wind back the clock.
Is that what you're doing? You're winding back the clock?
That is what I'm doing.
Well, keep winding. You've got quite a long way to go. Keep winding.
I don't want to fall in.
Well, you've got to get back to the beginning of time. We've got a long way to go. Well, keep winding. Keep winding. Until you get...
A singularity.
Space-time singularity. So the universe born from a black hole exploding.
Keep going.
What do you mean keep going? What? Before the universe began?
No. Keep going, develop the mathematics.
Stephen, Jane was telling me that you have a beautiful theorem. That proves that the universe had a beginning? Is that it?
That was my PhD thesis. My new project disproves it.
Disproves it?
Yeah.
Oh. So then you no longer believe in the creation?
What one believes is irrelevant in physics.
Irrelevant in physics.
Oh. I see.
Stephen's done a U-turn. The big new idea is that the universe has no boundaries at all. No boundaries, no beginning.
No God. Oh. Oh, I see. I thought that you'd proved the universe had a beginning and thus a need for a creator. My mistake.
No, mine.
Stephen is looking for a single theory that explains all the forces in the universe. Therefore, God must die.
Why must God die? I don't see.
The two great pillars of physics are quantum theory, the laws that govern the very small particles, electrons and so on, and general relativity.
Yes, Einstein.
Einstein's theory, the laws that govern the very large planets and such. But quantum and relativity...
Don't tell me. They're different?
They don't remotely play by the same rules. If the world were all potatoes, then easy. You could trace a precise beginning, as Stephen once did. A moment of creation. Hallelujah, God lives. If you incorporate peas into the menu, well, then it all goes a little...
Fits up.
Yes. God is back on the endangered species list.
Well, I expect you'll cope.
And physics is back in business.
Yes. Physics is back in business.
There are two things that are really outstanding about my father, and the first is his life in science and his work as a scientist, and the second is his humanity and his courage, because he's suffered so greatly, kept on day after day, working, making great discoveries in science, communicating his discoveries to a popular audience, and maintaining his sense of humour. And sometimes I think he's become such a familiar, iconic figure that people have almost forgotten how much he suffered, how hard it is for him to do what he does.
If the universe gave you a giant gift tomorrow, an answer, what's the answer you'd most want?
I want to know why the universe exists, why there is something rather than nothing.
Hawking has said he believes in the creative majesty of scientific law, not a personal God for humans.
When you look at the vast size of the universe, and how insignificant and accidental human life is in it, that seems most implausible.
And it doesn't seem to make you sad ever that we are so insignificant in the universe.
There is a fundamental difference between religion, which is based on authority, and science, which is based on observation and reason. Science will win, because it works.
we have discovered how the laws of nature, acting on the mass and energy of the universe, started a process that would eventually produce us, sitting here on our planet, pretty pleased at having worked it all out. So when people ask me if a god created the universe, I tell them that the question itself makes no sense. Time didn't exist before the Big Bang, so there is no time for God to make the universe in. It's like asking for directions to the edge of the Earth. The Earth is a sphere, it doesn't have an edge, so looking for it is a futile exercise.
We are each free to believe what we want, and it's my view that the simplest explanation is, there is no God. No one created the universe, and no one directs our fate. This leads me to a profound realization. There is probably no heaven, and no afterlife either. One life to appreciate the grand design of the universe. For that, I am extremely grateful.
Church, isn't it? Right. Well, let me just get this ready. And Simon, could I invite you up? It's quite a subject to be speaking on. That's why I've asked Simon to come and do it instead of me. I'll hand straight over to you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I want to say a big thank you for inviting me. It's been 18 months since we left the church here, but as soon as I arrived, it felt like just yesterday. It's great to see so many people that I recognize, and also encouraging to see many people that I don't recognize. God has clearly blessed this church since Lynn and I left it, although I hope there's not a direct causal link between those two statements. We bring greetings, Lynn and I, from our new church, Christ Church Westbourne, and trust that we take yours back with us. So, what are we dealing with? Stephen Hawking is, without doubt, the world's most famous living scientist. He has one of the highest ever recorded IQs. He has 12 honorary degrees. He was awarded the CBE in 1982 and was made a Companion of Honor in 1989. He is the recipient of many awards, medals, and prizes. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society and a member of the US National Academy of Sciences. For 30 years, he held the Lucasian Chair of Mathematics at Cambridge, a chair once held by Isaac Newton. He is regularly compared in the same breath with Albert Einstein and Isaac Newton. And he has also appeared on The Simpsons. He is 13 years ahead of me in age, but he is light years ahead of me in intellectual and scientific attainment. So you might be forgiven for thinking, Simon, what on earth are you doing standing up here and doing this talk? I got a 2-1 at Kingston Polytechnic, and besides all these qualifications here, it sinks into insignificance. Well, I have to hold up my hands in my defense and say, I didn't volunteer. I was asked. And secondly, I would also say I'm not going to comment on the science. I can't because I'm not a scientist. And even if I wanted to, the moment I opened my mouth to speak about science, I would only prove that I am a fool. But I only want to consider the theological and philosophical conclusions that he draws from his science. And to that end, I owe a great deal of gratitude to John Lennox and his book, God and Stephen Hawking. And there are a few copies of these available if you're interested in that. Much that is helpful, I hope, comes from him, and any defects come from me. Now, time only permits to look at 3 quotations. or groups of quotations around a particular subject, and to draw some conclusions. And because I was only given 20 minutes, then it's going to be limited what I'm going to be able to do. And only then will I consider what Jesus would say to him. But one thing I can be sure of is that were Jesus to come back and to give a response to Stephen Hawking, it would not be what we or Stephen Hawking could ever expect. Now, the first quotation is this, and this is an answer to a question. And when you remember that when Stephen Hawking answers a question in public, the question has to be asked in advance, and he then has carefully to formulate the answer through his voice synthesizer. So nothing comes off the top of his head. This is a reasoned response. And I want you to think about this quotation. I'm going to read it to you twice, and I want you to let it land upon you. I believe there are no questions that science can't answer about a physical universe. I believe there are no questions that science can't answer about a physical universe. Now, it's one thing to say that science answers a lot of questions well. It is quite another thing to say that it answers every single question that can be asked. Now, atheistic scientists have tried to explain such phenomena as ethics, morality, aesthetics, and rationality in terms of pure science. But at these points, in my opinion, they are at their weakest. In my opinion, they are at best inadequate. For example, in the field of ethics, science can tell you how to construct an atomic bomb, but it will not tell you whether it is right to use one. Or take music and literature. Science can tell us what music is in terms of vibrations hitting the eardrum, but it can't help with what is good music and what is not, or what is a good novel, or what is pulp fiction. Or take the emotion of love. What is love? Sounds like a cue for a song, doesn't it? What is love? What is it? Well, medically, love is premature ventricular contractions. It is increased blood flow to the brain in all of the right places. It is stimulation of dopamine transmission. Now, these may be scientifically or medically correct, but are they adequate? Was it this that inspired Shakespeare, Keats, Byron, Shelley? Is that all? A scientific description of what love is? Can science really, adequately, completely, and satisfactorily answer any and every question? Listen to a quote from a well-known, respected secular author, Peter Medawar, in his book, Advice to Young Scientists. There is no quicker way for a scientist to bring discredit upon himself and on his profession than roundly to declare, particularly when no declaration of any kind is called for, that science knows or soon will know the answers to all questions worth asking, and that the questions that do not admit a scientific answer are in some way non-questions or pseudo-questions that only simpletons ask and only the gullible profess to answer. Well, that's the first quotation. It may be that you want to come back on that later, and we can talk about that. Secondly, about the eternal universe. Listen to this quotation. One could say the boundary condition of the universe is that it has no boundary. That was mentioned, if you remember, in the video here. It has no boundary, no rim. The universe would be completely self-contained and not affected by anything outside itself. It would neither be created nor destroyed. It would just be. I'd like to read that again, but it's too long a quote, so I'll just read the last bit. It would neither be created nor destroyed. It would just be. We live in a contingent universe where everything which comes into existence has a cause. But what about the ultimate cause? The Christian may say that the ultimate cause is an eternal God. Hawking says the ultimate cause is an eternal universe. But how will we make our choice? Eternal God or eternal universe? Is it not a matter of faith? The Christian would say, by faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command. That's Hebrews 11 and verse 2. But what about the atheist? It would neither be created nor destroyed. It would just be. The universe just is. Now, neither can be proved completely. Neither can be proved, but one or other is the answer. The question is, which one? In the film The Theory of Everything, and you saw a few quotes from it, and if you haven't seen it, it is a brilliant film. It's superb. And the thing I liked most about it was the very spirited exchanges between Jane and Stephen, particularly the ones before they're married. Although you saw an extended exchange on the video, but there's some lovely exchanges early on in the film between Hawking and his future wife Jane on religious matters. And I want to give you a few to give you a flavour. Jane asks, what do cosmologists worship? A single unifying equation that explains everything in the universe. What is cosmology? Hawking, it's a kind of religion for intelligent atheists. A kind of religion. Isn't that a funny thing to say? But why not God? Hence another exchange. So I take it you've never been to church, says Jane. Hawking says, once upon a time. Jane, tempted to convert? Hawking, I have a slight problem with the celestial dictatorship premise. In other words, I don't like the whole idea of a God being in control. But what about this? If the universe just is, and we're governed by inexorable scientific laws, do you not just exchange a celestial dictator for a blind, faceless, mindless, and merciless one? And then one final quote. And I've not been able to find where this was said or written, but it's on every website. If you look up quotes from Stephen Hawking on every website, this quotation appears. He must have said it or written it at one time. You cannot understand the glories of the universe without believing there is some supreme power behind it. Well, amen to that. The third quotation is completely different. It's not actually to do with science at all. And it's about hope. This quote comes from the film. And so you need to see the film and to see the context of it. He's giving a lecture, and there's many, many people there. And there he is sitting in his wheelchair, speaking through his voice synthesizer. He says this: there should be no boundaries to human endeavor. We're all different. However bad life may seem, there's always something you can do and succeed at. While there's life, there's hope. And as you can imagine, in the film, one by one people applause, and they stand up and they applause vigorously. As well they might. You just can't help. And I couldn't help, as I've been reading him and reading things like this, you can't help but warm to such sheer tenacity and bravery. Here is a man reaching out from a body wasting away to something beyond, something to make sense of his condition and encouraging others to do the same. It is noble, it is brave, it is inspiring. But then, not on the film, he says elsewhere, he says this, just when he's offered hope in hopeless circumstances, he says this: I regard the brain as a computer which will stop working when its components fail. There is no heaven or afterlife for broken down computers. That is a fairy story for people afraid of the dark. Hope springs eternal, but it cannot survive. It must fail when the computer breaks down. As he says in the film, his mind is free until the computer fails. Where there is life, there is hope. But where there is death, hope dies. The very thing hoped for cannot in the end be satisfied. C.S. Lewis, when writing about hope in his book Mere Christianity, wrote these deathless words: if I discover within myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. But for the atheist, there is no other world, no boundary, nothing beyond. To paraphrase John Lennox, is it really true that heaven and the afterlife is only a fairy story for people afraid of the dark? Is it not the case that atheism is a fairy story for those afraid of the light? Well, what would Jesus say? You'll say, I haven't answered that question, and I haven't. What I've tried to do is to give some responses that Christians might make to some of the things that Stephen Hawking has said, particularly about God or the non-existence of God. But what about Jesus? As I said at the beginning, one thing we can be sure of is that were he to come back and give a response, it would not be what we or Stephen Hawking could ever expect. I can suggest some of the things he said to other people who crossed his path that might have an implication here for him. For example, you must be born again, he said to Nicodemus, a very bright, intelligent ruler. He said, you must be born again, and if you're not, you won't even see the kingdom. However, this was said to a sincere seeker, and I'm not sure Hawking is seeking God at all, so perhaps that's not relevant here, I don't know. Render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's, he said to the Pharisees. Caesar has a realm, and so does God. So don't give to one what should be given to the other. However, that was a political question, so perhaps that's not really appropriate either. You do not understand the scriptures or the power of God, he said to the Sadducees, who wanted to deny the resurrection by making fun of it. However, Hawking doesn't engage much with the scriptures. Perhaps we'd better ask what Stephen Hawking is really concerned about, and that is the theory of everything. A theory that will connect up all the laws of the universe, in particular the laws of quantum physics and the laws of general relativity. A set of equations which links these two together. Is there anything that speaks to this? There's only one I can think of, and it's with this I'm going to conclude this little presentation. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John chapter 1, verse 1. What is this word, or logos? Well, it was a philosophical term known to people of the time, and John uses it in his gospel. Leon Morris says in his commentary, and listen to this, it denoted something like the world soul, the soul of the universe. It was an all-pervading principle, the rational principle of the universe. Perhaps we're getting a little closer to home here. This is beginning to sound like what Stephen Hawking is looking for. But is the word an abstract theory? Is it a set of equations? No, because we also learn from John that the Word became flesh and lived for a while among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John chapter 1, verse 14. The Word was a person, and the Word was God himself. The Word is not a set of equations linking all scientific laws, but a person that can be known, a person that can be received, a person able to give the right for believers to become his children. Perhaps Jesus might deal with him as he dealt with the woman at the well, combining two things here. In John chapter 4, at the end of the conversation, he's talking to a woman, and the woman is desperate to keep God at arm's length because she's concerned about the implications of God. And so she says, I know that Messiah, called Christ, is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us. Then Jesus declared, I who speak to you am he. At the end of his bestseller, A Brief History of Time, Hawking said, if we do discover a complete theory, we would know the mind of God. I wonder whether Jesus would say this: that which explains everything is standing before you. Not an equation, not a law of physics, not a theory, but a person by whom and through whom everything came into being. A person who could be known, a person who is at the same time the eternal God, one who can make you his child. Well, I could have gone on a lot longer. As Churchill said once, he apologized after a long speech. And he said, I do apologize because I didn't have the opportunity of preparing a shorter one. I prepared a shorter one. It could have been twice the length and still not finished. So hopefully that'll open up some thinking, some thoughts, some questions, and the opportunity will be given in a moment to do that. But thank you for listening. You want that back?
Thank you, Simon. As Simon just said, take a seat up here, Simon. You'll be back there in a second anyway. As Simon just said, just in a few moments, we're going to have a time for Q&A, so get your thinking caps on and be prepared for what you're going to think about. And we're going to have a panel up here. And just a reminder that it's not going to be live streamed, so that's a reminder to you guys up there to turn off the live stream. That'd be helpful.